Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. And as we believe on this show, a dialogue is all about different perspectives, different ideas, and making sure that they're all heard. Who better for that this evening than two economic minds? I'm joined by N.K. Singh and also Professor Jean Drèze as we look at the state of India's economy, India's social welfare, universal basic income as an idea, and lots more. Thank you both very much for being on this show. Mr. Singh, it's been a week where interestingly we've seen figures which seem to have vindicated the Prime Minister's move on demonetization. It's cut the Harvard economists down to size, as the Prime Minister seemed to indicate, and point to the fact that, well, India is still the fastest growing economy in the world and things are in good shape. Would you agree?
Well, you know, apart from the recent data on the GDP numbers, which has certainly laid to rest some of the dark misgivings which many eminent economists had, some of which has been eluded by the Prime Minister, there are two other supporting documents apart from this GDP numbers, which more or less come to the same kind of a conclusion, not perhaps in those explicit terms. This week also saw the presentation of the Article 4 consultations by the IMF with their 2017 report. In fact, it was only released a week ago. And day before yesterday, I was present at the release of the biennial survey by the OECD on the economic survey of India. There are strong commonalities in two reports done by independent multilateral international institutions, the IMF and the OECD, which have more or less come to the same kind of conclusion. Growth rates in India are robust, macroeconomic fundamentals look very strong, the path of fiscal consolidation has done a lot to enhance government's credibility, all other macro parameters look good. Demonetization effect really is muted and is at best will totally trail off in the first half of 2017, and that therefore the prospect of India getting back to 7.4% plus growth rates in the next fiscal year are reasonably high. They have pointed out to some challenges, and these are challenges with which no government, particularly this government, would like to shy away. I mean, they have pointed out, Sonia, to the challenges of banking financial system, the stressed assets, the corporate sector, the revival of private investment, and so on. But these are okay, but on the broad picture, quite apart from this estimate of the CSO, there are other supporting contemporary multilateral international institutions deep analysis.
India is on the right track. We're a bright spot. All's well with the world. Would you agree?
No. Firstly, I don't think that even if the figures that have just been released on GDP are correct, which I think is a little unlikely, I don't think that would vindicate the Prime Minister's views. If you go back to his speech on 8th of November, he told a story to the Indian public there that has completely fallen apart. I mean, he gave the impression that there was a huge stash of black money in cash there waiting to be flushed out and disabled, and that obviously has not happened at all. So I think that instead of making disparaging comments about Harvard economists, he could do with a course in economics himself, if not at Harvard, then at least somewhere in Delhi or maybe in Ahmedabad. But anyway, so I don't think that, well, firstly, if that story was not correct, and it is not correct by any stretch of the imagination, then I think he owes the public now an explanation as to what it actually was about and what is the evidence that the objective has been achieved. The GDP figures, you know, all the estimates I feel at this point are very speculative. I mean, you know, it's too early. About half of the economy, the informal sector, is below the statistical radar, and that's the half that has been most badly hit by demonetization. The latest estimates that have come from the CSO don't really fit very well at all with any of the earlier estimates, whether it's IMF, whether it's the economic survey.
But are you doubting the figures by the CSO?
Well, I find them hard to believe. I'm not an accountant, and I'm not going to spend my time going through the nitty-gritty of it. I'm sure that others will question them and analyze them. But it would be very surprising if the economy had actually picked up after demonetization. I mean, it's very hard to think of any kind of economic model that could lead to that prediction. And then, you know, in the informal sector, there's not much statistical evidence, but there are a lot of reports that are actually quite informative. There are, of course, plenty of media reports. There are surveys, including some surveys that I've been involved in myself. There are reports from Manufacturers Association, all giving a pretty bleak picture. And that brings me to the last point, which is that, it's not so much, the issue is not so much the growth of GDP. Of course, that is important, and of course, over time, there is some kind of correlation between GDP growth and people's living conditions. But in this situation, it's a very different thing. And what really matters is what happened to people's livelihoods. And I think on that, we have no evidence at all to feel that we're doing well.
But let me just ask you, Professor Therese, because I think perhaps the argument is not that it's because of demonetization or that it's doing well, but despite demonetization, that the Indian economy is in strong shape. We've seen surprising results from the agriculture sector, from manufacturing, which has shown a growth.
I don't think we know that, and I think even if that were true, I don't think that would justify what has happened. It was a huge gamble with an economy that was doing well, and with people's lives, people who were on the margin of subsistence and who were pushed to the wall by this. And there is evidence of that having happened. On exactly what scale, we don't know. So I'm not at all reassured. But obviously, it's possible that the economy will bounce back relatively soon. I mean, that I said myself right at the beginning, that anything can happen. But I don't think that justifies what has been done.
Do you think, and I'll ask both of you this question, do you think the benefit of demonetization, which may not have been assessed enough, and what the finance minister says that the reason why these figures are so good is because so much money has now come into the formal sector, so your revenues have gone up, whether it's taxes or indirect taxes, and this is money that will eventually be used for welfare schemes.
But that comes back to what I'm saying, that there may be some positive spin-offs. Even wars have positive spin-offs in Europe.
The defense industry.
No, but even sometimes for people. I mean, in the world wars in Europe, the welfare state was born out of that. Nutrition sometimes improved. Women came out of their houses. That doesn't justify war. So you can mention some positive side effects. The point is, you have to clarify what was the objective and whether that objective has been achieved, and what is the evidence of that. Otherwise, spin-offs, they are positive and negative. We can discuss them.
Mr. Singh, when we look at the benefits of demonetization, and perhaps also the paradigm shift in how the Modi government is dealing with political economy, or looking at economics also as a way towards a political gain, say different from what Prime Minister Modi has often disparagingly referred to as the UPA government's welfare economics, saying a welfare state, handing out dole. Is that part of the shift? Interestingly, of course, at the same time, we saw in this budget that funds have been allocated to Manrega higher than before, though of course there's still huge issues, which I'm sure Professor Therese will bring up, about actual payments of those funds. What exactly is Prime Minister Modi's economics? Professor Therese said perhaps he should take a course in economics, but his brand of political economics working or not?
Well, first let me make a comment on something that Jean Therese said, that the Prime Minister owes an explanation. Equally, I think that some of the distinguished economists owe an explanation for having traumatized this nation falsely on the likely negative impacts of demonetization, predicting collapse of GDP, mass unemployment, huge return of migrant workers, dislocation of
who predicted
production.
Collapse of GDP? Who predicted collapse
Dr.
of GDP?
Manmohan Singh.
No, 2%. He said 2%.
I mean, the point is
2%
collapse,
2%
of collapse of GDP. Dr. Manmohan Singh, I presume you count him as a distinguished economist,
as far as
for whatever it might be. There was, for instance, Mr. Krugman, who came.
Professor Therese said all the distinguished economists are on the same side.
Almost all. I have never seen such unanimity in the economics profession, from Partha Sen, Amartya Sen, Pranab Sen.
So what I mean is that these economists,
Prabhat Patnaik, from left to right.
Economists owe an explanation for having falsely traumatized this nation into a fair psychology of what demonetization would do. And I think that some of the anecdotal evidence of Jean, for which some of the surveys I have respect, remain anecdotal. And I think that it is possible to magnify.
But in the informal sector, what do we have except anecdotal? That is the problem. In the informal sector,
but I think on informal sector, there is a fair amount of robust work. For instance, in my own report, which deals with the fiscal consolidation program, I have some robust work done on the informal sector, which brings out people like Neelkant Mishra and others who are working with the Credit Suisse, have done enormous amount of work in the informal sector. And none of that, Sonia, seems to suggest that the demonetization has worked in a manner which is so deleterious as it is really painted. Now, where I do not disagree is that the fourth quarter estimates on the GDP, it's possible that it may self-correct some of the stuff which has come out. It's possible that the implications on the informal sector may come out, but as the data exists today, the preponderance of evidence suggests that notwithstanding that correction, any any kind of an analysis which suggests such a negative impact on the economy was exaggerated, and data seems to suggest to the contrary.
No, I'm sorry. The distinguished economists have questioned the purpose of this demonetization move. They have pointed out that it will not serve the purpose that has been stated. On that, I think they have been proved right. And they have warned that there would be serious economic consequences, and on that, I think they have also been proved right.
But was it alarmist, as Mr. Singh said?
Some
2%
people may
of
have
GDP.
made alarmist statements, but I think the
An
anxiety
unguided
was
missile, as
that
Professor
the
Sen
consequences
said.
were so unpredictable, and I think they still are.
And Professor Sen went to the extent of saying
Which
that
Sen?
it was a
They are-
despotic step.
Which Sen? Many Sens have criticized it. Professor Amartya Sen?
I'm sure both of us
Abhijit,
mean the same
there are
Sen
plenty,
in this particular context. But
And I'm sure the Prime Minister means the same Sen.
calling it a very despotic move by the Prime Minister. And I do not agree that the purpose of some of this has not been served.
Let
What was the purpose? So what was the
Professor Dress
purpose?
go ahead.
Because sometimes it's cashlessness, sometimes it's recapitalizing of banks, sometimes it's flushing out the black cash. What is
I
the
think
purpose?
it is a congregation of purpose and attitudinal change in the
That's
manner
not
in
what
which
we
you
were
could-
told.
For instance, there is no doubt that the push it will give to the formalization of the informal sector is very,
But
very
what
significant
about- there has
when
to be
coupled
some coherence
when
between
coupled
the
with
ends
other
and the
things.
means.
The
You ca-
fact that
But Professor Dress, let me ask you, because you, as Mr. Singh referred to anecdotal evidence, and you said it's more than anecdotal.
Well, I
but
think
do you see? Do
it
you
adds
see?
up. You know, there have been surveys. I mean, I have been involved in 2 surveys in Ranchi and around Ranchi, which I consider more than anecdotal. But then there have been others in Amritsar, in Bombay, in Delhi, and it does add up to a picture that actually makes sense to an economist. That you've disabled 86% of the cash, so naturally there's a crisis of purchasing power. Naturally, some factories close or slow down. Then some people have to lose their jobs. I mean, this is it's also a matter of economic analysis.
And it's just seen as collateral damage. You feel it's not. It's
Well,
not analyzed.
it's not even
properly.
called collateral damage. It's called inconvenience. Now, what is true is that exactly quantitatively, no, you can be misled by media reports. You can get an exaggerated impression. Some people may have made alarmist statements, perhaps. But the point is that there is a serious economic shock and uncertainty being created, and the consequences, I think, have already been quite serious, including some 90 people dying in bank queues and so on and so forth. You know, these are really things that should have received more attention, including in the budget.
You said interestingly just now that all economists on
By
the
the
same.
way, I consider Arvind Subramanian also as a distinguished economist, and he has been keeping quiet because he doesn't know what to say. I mean, he's obviously not
But he
convinced.
says
and
lots of things.
No, but interestingly, so you're also an economist, Professor Dress. You said that point.
Distinguished, maybe not,
That
but-
point earlier, you said all economists on the same side. But looking
Pretty
at
much, not all of them, but,
But-
they are never on. But they are never all on the same side. But I have never seen so much unanimity among
this case.
eminent economists.
But let's look back to your days when you in a sense, were helping or advising government as part of the National Advisory Council, and what you've seen through the eyes of what actually works in changing people's lives. You've often questioned this correlation of and this obsession perhaps with GDP figures, and saying if you don't see a link with how people's lives are changing or people's lives are improving, issues like health, education, etc., what's the point of this GDP? You also, many of your suggestions, and again, as I said, this often became a political issue, but Professor Amartya Sen's suggestions, whether it was on Manrega, whether it was on other welfare economics, has been dismissed as dole economics. Today, when you look at what's happening,
Dismissed by whom?
well, by the BJP often, by opposition, even by within the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, even Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, often pushed back against some of the recommendations of the NAC. Looking at what's happening today in Prime Minister Modi's economics, what do you think is the way forward? And what do you think is happening now? How would you see the kind of change with the JAM, Aadhaar, the whole Holy Trinity being talked about?
I think there has to be a much better recognition of the importance of social policy as an integral part of economic policy. Right now, the government seems to be obsessed with the rate of growth and the power of India economically and otherwise in the Indian economy, and leaving social policy to the states. I think that's a big mistake, and that's failing to recognize the progress that has actually been made in the last 10 years because of finally some sort of departure from decades of inertia, you know, in the field of health, education, social security, and so on and so forth. And finally, now we are seeing some action and some results. And so the time is to consolidate that and to say, okay, we have to go forward. And actually, the government is doing the opposite. I think that's where there's a real failure of vision on the part of this new government.
But the universal
And actually,
vaccine.
not just this new government, even the UPA too had already lost the story on that, I think.